Hi.
Yeah.
Hello and welcome back to That Aged Well. And this week I'm joined by Robert Ferguson, who has recently published Norway's War, 1940 to 1945, which I'm of course holding up here, which came out earlier this year. And it's an absolute fantastic book that you absolutely should read. And I want to begin by asking, because there's been a lot in no, though there's been no lack of books in the Norwegian community, and in Norway, of course, there's one entire bookshop and category of the Second World War in Norway.
Mm.
Just in itself, in the Norwegian community, there has been a lack of the Norwegian events in the international community, and I think yours is the first one really to come out as that entirely focuses on Norway under the Second World War. So what do you think, apart from the obvious reason being language barrier, what do you think is the main reason we had a lack thereof of, the in the international community of Norway or other countries for that matter in the Second World War? I mean, for one example, James Holland, for example, in his book The War in the West, he briefly mentions Norway a few times, but there's in general not really mentioned at all in the general histories of the Second World War. So just maybe once, and what is even more fascinating is that Norway was the first Allied victory, even though it was a short-lived one. So what do you think it's the lack of I'm not going to say interest in the Second World War in Norway?
Well, you make up the obvious point. That the first point is that there were so few people. There have been so few people. There are more now, but for many decades there were so few people, British people, who had access to Norwegian sources, which of course is essential to writing a book about Norway. And the situation has changed now. There are many more people. There's far more interest in Norway than there ever was when I was a young man, and
Mm.
so that's the one very obvious reason. I think another reason is probably that not a great deal happened in Norway once the occupation was a fact. It happened very quickly. It was over. The invasion was on the
That's not
9th of April.
entirely true, though, as you know.
What you say?
It's
What?
not entirely true that not a whole lot happened in Norway
No, I
during the
mean not a whole lot
occupation.
happened in terms of
Yeah,
of things that were crucial to the
yeah,
development
that's fair.
of the war. So not a whole lot happened. Of course, it was full of events for Norwegians and ordinary human beings, but in a strictly military tactical sense, uh, the war was the occupation of Norway had no
Mm.
huge significance. That may be one reason, but another and probably even greater reason is that for the Anglophone world, the world of British readers, English language speakers and readers, the occupation has very largely been focused on what happened in France.
Yeah.
And I can remember this very well from my own upbringing that there were lots of books about the French resistance, the Marquis, the Yeo Thomas, the White Rabbit, all these sort of things. They were very well-known figures. So that what attention there was that was dedicated to the fate of the occupied countries largely was directed towards France and also to a certain degree towards Holland, where of course
Poland, of course, not yet not significant for obvious reasons as well.
well, yes, but and one of the perhaps less obvious reasons is the fame achieved by Anne Frank's
Yeah.
diary, of course, which was one of the most famous books in the modern world,
Mm.
in which of course she gave her account of the so. But Norway had no similar figure to offer the world. Norway had no similar figure whose importance, as it were, or whose personal experience of the war somehow transcended
Yeah.
the occupation. So I think those are the main reasons.
So let's begin then at 1940, 9th April, or actually before that, I want to start a little bit because Norway obviously was started out as a neutral country, and it was Quisling who actually got Hitler interested. So let's talk about Hitler's interest in Norway and why he wanted to start to occupy Norway in the first place. So, I mean that his main excuse were that Britain were, of course, planting what mines in Norwegian waters, but that's not about the real reason why Hitler wanted Norway as a country under the Third Reich.
Well, I think if we stick to the practical point, I think that Hitler was in fact not entirely convinced of the need to occupy Norway, and Quisling persuaded him that it was necessary to do so. Um, I think that the Germans firmly believed, with some reason, that if they didn't occupy Norway, then the British would have occupied Norway. I mean,
Mm.
it's a matter about which there's still some debate. Uh, and as events turned out, particularly we mentioned earlier Neuvic, which was the first Allied victory, but it was a hollow victory because once the
Yeah,
French had surrendered, then they had to abandon Neuvic. So I think that, I mean, perhaps what you're looking at here, what you're suggesting by your question is, was there some other kind of,
mm,
was there some feeling of a kind of special relationship with the Norwegians and the Scandinavians in general,
mm.
which fitted in with the whole Nazi philosophy, if you like, of
It's
the Aryan people, the Nordic people, and
yeah.
so on, and that this was some kind of that this was actually really a brother's occupation, and that it wouldn't encounter much resistance, and that the Norwegians would
It's
gradually and quite swiftly come to realize that they were actually Germans themselves.
as it's kind of ironic then that Norwegian wouldn't have any of it, any of the German occupation at all. That they because the Germans really believe that they were this Aryan race and the mass one of the parts, because of, like you said, the Scandinavian folklore is kind of ironic that they didn't want any of it.
Yeah.
Most people
But
anyway.
Yeah, but also it is important to remember, and this is a little bit off the subject, but traditionally in the 19th century, particularly when Norway was, as it were, creating its
Yeah.
national identity in the process that led up to 1905, almost all the great artists who achieved world fame came to prominence through German
Mm.
enthusiasm. And we're talking about Edvard Munch, we're talking about Henrik Ibsen, we're talking about Edvard Grieg, we're talking about all the great national romantic painters like Dahl. They all came to prominence through Germany, so they felt they owed a cultural debt. But that was the 19th century. The 20th century, with the Russian Revolution and so on, and the appearance on the national scene of international communism, international socialism, that completely changed the dynamic of the relationship
Yeah.
between the Scandinavian countries and Germany.
Mm. So let's go then to 9th April 1940 when Blücher enters the Oslo fjord, and of course the famous saying in I'm going to paraphrase in Norwegian here and try to translate it as best as I can, which of course the famous saying goes, the general says they are in doubt actually whether they should fire on the ship, it was the German planning was disguised as such as that it shouldn't seem like an enemy ship, that it would come as a surprise. And when they finally found out what that were a German ship, the generals famous to say "Visst fanden skal det skytes," or "Damn
Yeah,
right, you shall fire." And
yeah,
but
yeah.
it took some time before they finally realized that this was indeed an enemy ship, because the Germans disguised this so well at the beginning of the invasion.
Mm, yeah. Well, it took place in the dead of night, as we know, at the same time as which they attacked this. As they attacked Denmark, which was much easier because they
Mm.
share a border with Denmark. So it was much more difficult to attack Norway. They had to be much more cunning. They had this long, particularly if they were going to take Oslo, they had this long Oslo fjord to navigate. Uh, and they worked out quite an elaborate plan with 5 landing sites, with Narvik in the north down to all the way down to Oslo in the south. All the major coastal sites, the major population centres of Norway, Bergen, Stavanger, Kristiansand. And so it took quite a bit more planning and stealth than the invasion of Copenhagen, of Denmark, because when they invaded Denmark, the Danes just awoke and the German planes were in the sky. There was nothing they could do about it. Um, but as you say, they did. They came in the dead of night. They weren't flying flags. For a long time, people Norwegians weren't quite sure who they were. Were they ships that had been
Mm.
somehow wounded in a North Sea battle with the British
It could have been
Navy?
British ships.
Could have been British ships, yep. It was because, and as we spoke earlier, Norway had declared its neutrality just as it had done in the First World War, and it was,
Mm.
frankly, probably slightly a naive bunch of politicians
They
in
kind
charge
of
of the.
refused to do a military, have a military economy, and and they kind of defunded heavily there's an excellent book called the Night April Hour for Hour. It's not in English, but it's in the English translation where they talk about how they rejected and they kind of defunded the Norwegian military because they
Absolutely,
really
yeah,
believed that they would could keep their neutrality during
yeah.
the second, as same as they did in the First World War.
Yes, I mean the famous one of the famous images used by the Labour Party government in the 30s was "De Brukne Gevær," yeah, which is a image of a gun being broken in two.
Mm,
So they were dedicated to pacifism, and I think many of them really believed that it was enough to declare yourself neutral to be
mm.
accepted as a neutral. But of course, the Nazis made their own rules completely when it came to warfare.
I think one of the reasons we should mention as well, of course, why Norway would be of interest to Germany is that they, of course, had an ice report as well, and it would be, of course, it would be easy to conquer, possibly conquer Iceland as well, and then the United States from there. So the ice report was one vital reason as well, and of course, the trade with Sweden and Norway that they had to. I don't remember but the minerals they got from Sweden were, going through Norway. So that was also in Germany's interest. And again, Narvik is one of those ports that where the minerals came from Sweden. So that's one of the reasons as well why Germany were interested in Norway's neutrality, or at least having Norway's own. And so it's also worth mentioning, I think, that Sweden were more pro-Germany than and any of the Scandinavian countries, maybe Finland as well, but they were even Sweden were more, if not on the same side as Germany during the Second World War than the Norwegians were.
Mm. Yeah, well, the mineral you're talking about is malm, iron
Yeah,
ore, and it was
yeah,
essential to the German weapons industry. And of course, in fine weather conditions, they used the Baltic, but the Baltic froze up. The Baltic ports froze up, so they needed what Narvik had, as you say, because the Gulf Stream flows down there, this ice-free port, and so that was of crucial importance and that's really why the Brits were so interested in Narvik
mm.
and the French in trying to because they all knew how crucial that was to the fate of the war.
Churchill, time and time again, tried to get Operation Jupiter, but of course, North Africa became a bigger priority. But Churchill tried to get Operation Jupiter time and time again during the Second World War out in operation. And they were also talking about sending Indian army into Norway at some point, but it never happened. But Churchill were really an advocate for freeing Norway from the Nazi yoke.
Absolutely, yeah. But of course, it couldn't. Once France had surrendered
Mm.
uh, early in June 1940, the whole complexion of the war changed, and that's why, as we said earlier, they had to abandon Narvik. The French, and a few days later, Norway officially surrendered. The king and the
Yeah.
government left the country, and the occupation was a fact of daily Norwegian life.
So
And
let's talk about the fleeing of the government, and before we get into the occupation itself, and how Quisling would be the first one to do a coup of the government coup on the radio as well. And how quickly that name would turn into a synonym for traitor. So let's talk a little bit about the fleeing of the Norwegian government and the royal family to England.
well, the the main one of the main effects, in fact, the main effect, I would say, of the sinking of the Blue Kid on the night of April the 9th was that it gave it gave the people in Oslo some few hours advance warning of what was happening, that they were being invaded, and it gave the government, the cabinet, many of the politicians and the royal family, it gave them the opportunity to get out of the city to avoid being captured. Uh, and it gave them the opportunity further to. They travelled up to Elverum. It meant that they could then sit and they could reach an agreement among themselves, which was called the Elverum Fullmakt, which is an agreement which was ensured that throughout the 5 years that that occupation would last, the government would be the legal government of Norway, no matter what else happened and no matter what other attempts were made to uh, to put in place a Norwegian government. And so they left. They left, and after leaving Elverum and signing this Elverum Fullmakt, they then slowly made their way, constantly being attacked and hunted by German forces, who were particularly anxious to get hold of the king, to get the king to declare, for example, that Quisling, who declared himself prime minister of the country in this illegal coup almost immediately, the day after the invasion, they wanted the king to accept Quisling as the government. The king absolutely refused to do so. And well, the upshot of it was that they, of course, that they did. The king and the government finally, in June, once the French surrendered and Narvik had been abandoned, they made their way over to the British Isles and they spent the war in the British Isles. But they remained the legal government of Norway throughout. And Quisling's attempt to take over the reins of power, it's in a sense it's very understandable because with the departure of the king and the crown prince and the government, and most of it was arranged by the Hambro, the speaker of the Storting of the House of Commons. Um, with the departure of those figures of authority, there was no one left in charge in Oslo. There was no one, and Quisling, there was simply an enormous power vacuum, and Quisling was not unprepared for this to happen, I think. And he went on the radio and he announced that he was the new Prime Minister of Norway, and he had even had a list of cabinet ministers who were going to serve under him, none of whom had been consulted by him before, and many of whom, like Jonas Lie, were completely surprised and immediately took exception to it and said, no, it's nothing to do with me. So within a very few days, that attempt to establish a government by Quisling was nipped in the bud, and other arrangements were reached.
Hmm. And I think it's also worth mentioning that when you talked about Denmark, they surrendered immediately, and the king were allowed to remain in Denmark as a puppet, kind of under the Nazi government there. So there seemed to be a huge difference between the Danish surrender and the Norwegian. I wouldn't say surrender, but the Norwegian takeover, perhaps is a better word. So there's a complete difference between the Danish surrender and the Norwegian takeover from the Nazi yoke.
Yeah, indeed. I think often I think there's still people will still discuss in a rather heated fashion whether or not it was right of the government to leave. And I'm not sure that I certainly know that the Crown Prince Olaf did not want to leave, but he was told that he must leave the country. He certainly felt that his place was here in Norway with his people. The king, who was a much older man, of course, he did what the government told him to do, but as things transpired in Denmark, for example, the king did not become exactly a puppet, and the Danes even held a democratic election as late as I think it was 1942, in which the Nazis stood and got about the usual 2% of the vote. So that for a long time, Denmark was rather protected from the worst excesses of Nazi occupation by the very fact that they had their own authority figures governing them, their own king and their own parliament. Whereas from day one, almost from day one, Norway was in the hands of Nazis.
If you don't mind, I want to give a little background on Quisling first before we go into his reign of power in Norway. And we discussed this before we recorded as well earlier, that there is some historians who believe that he was autistic, that he was on the spectrum. And what are your thoughts there? And what can you give us a little bit background history of of Quisling as a and how he came into politics, and now we would found his political party National Samling and National Unity if, in English. So let's talk a little bit in the background and your thoughts on Quisling.
Uh, well, he was his father was a priest. He grew up. Um, he went to military college, and there he turned. He was the most brilliant student that ever studied at military college. He got his marks were unheard of. They were excellent. They were almost infallible. Um, he became a prominent figure in Norwegian public life in the aftermath of the Russian Revolution, when he became the
Is
great
that what
Fritjof.
radicalized him to turn to the right side
No,
of
no,
the?
it isn't. No, no, it isn't. He had no known political profile at this time, but he came to prominence among Norwegians as a man who was Fridtjof Nansen's closest assistant in the famine relief that took place in the Ukraine after the Russian Revolution. And in those early days, if he had any kind of, he had almost had a kind of enthusiastic, or not, he had a kind of acceptance and an interest in communism, in the whole idea of a revolution. But what radicalized him towards the right was when he was taken into Hunside's government, the Bondeparti, the Farmers' Party government in the early 1930s, and by which time international communism, international socialism had gained a real foothold in Norway. And the Norwegian Labour Party at that time was well to the left of any other Labour Party in Europe, apart obviously from Russia. And when the Labour government eventually came to power, it was well to the left of any other elected government in Western Europe. But what happened in Quisling's case when he was the Minister of Defence in the Hunside Farmers' Party government in about 1932, I think it was that there was a huge strike, a lockout at the hydro factory of this enormous factory, with thousands of people on strike, and the police were sent in to protect the strike breakers. And there was a very fierce battle. It's called the Slag of Menstad, the Menstad battle, which is where this place was. And Quisling's reputation as a strong man was established there when he sent in the navy and the army. He sent in the military to quell that strike action. And from that point onwards, I think he became convinced that international communism, international socialism was planning a revolution in Norway, and that action had to be taken along the lines of the action that had been taken by Hitler and the Nazis in Germany in the 1920s. So that's why, I think it was 1934, he formulated or he founded the party National Unity, National Samling, and he founded it, and he was very careful to distinguish it immediately from the fascism of Mussolini or even from Hitler's own National Samling. He very deliberately tried to give it Viking roots. His closest bodyguard was called the Hird, which is what the Viking Age chieftains would surround themselves with, men called the Hird. He held the party's first rallies were at very significant places in Viking Age history, like Stiklestad and the Borre. And so that's when he got, as we would say now, radicalized, and that's when he came to believe that it was going to be a war to the death between extreme left and extreme right
Mm.
in the
So let's talk
1930s.
about him in power, because I think it's fair to say he was quite incompetent and to be the head of state, to be fair. So let's talk about how even in the first few days, he was almost immediately deposed and kind of be replaced in a puppet. But from a book I read quite a few years ago, he did kind of seem to want an independent Norway under a right-wing government after this war was finished. Though it's hardly unlikely, even if the Nazis had won, that would have happened. But that was his goal, that they would be independent under his government after the war had finished. So let's talk about how incompetent he were as a leader and head of state.
Well, I think one of the things that struck me repeatedly as I was working on that book was the how little respect the leading German Nazis who met him had for him. Goebbels, Ted Boffen, who was who was Hitler's the ex-commissar in Norway, Himmler, Heinrich Himmler. All of these people were absolutely. They had no time for him at all. They could not see that he had any charismatic qualities at all, which was one of the cornerstones of a National Socialist system.
And even
Is
today, right-wing politicians, I think it's fair to say, it's an awful comparison, but Farage kind of have a charisma as well. You can see it as right-wing as he may be. You don't admit he has a kind of charisma that can be appealing to young people.
Indeed, yes, indeed. Well, charisma is very important. You get it on the left and the right. All, I mean, even Stalin had charisma. I think because even Donald Trump has charisma. It's just a almost mystical quality, and it's very hard to resist for the rational
Mm.
intellect. But the rational intellect has to try to resist it, and um, and Quisling did not have this quality, and I think that and one of his few cards, but it was a very important card throughout the war, was that he enjoyed the support and gratitude of Adolf Hitler for the kind of information and military advice he had given him in the months before the war regarding England and how important he thought it was that they should not allow Norway to fall into the hands of an English occupation force. So he was able to withstand all the kind of contempt and attempts to replace him by people like Ted Boffen and Goebbels and Himmler and so on, and Heydrich. He was able to deal with that because he always had Hitler always had his back in that sense. But it was not. It was based on gratitude. It was not based on any real
No
assessment.
respect.
No, it wasn't based on an assessment of his actual qualities as a leader. And so but the odd thing is, if this is slightly jumping ahead of ourselves, maybe, but the odd thing is that Miloig, the military arm of the Norwegian resistance movement, when this eventually appeared and became active, they were actually really quite pleased at his incompetence, and they were quite pleased at his incompetence, and they resisted every attempt to have him assassinated because they thought it worked. And I think correctly, it worked to their advantage to have such an incompetent person in charge of the Norwegian government.
Mm. So let's talk about the obvious first step of this new government, which was trying to Nazify Norway and be getting them into, this Nazi-friendly country. So what was the process like? And obviously the school, and as we've seen even with today, like in Russia, for example, or United States, you see even the United States, you see that young people are always trying to appeal because they are the one who are the next generation
Mm.
of scholars or workers. So the obviously the schools were one of the first places the Nazis would go to try to Nazify the Norwegian people. So let's talk a little bit about the Nazification of Norway.
Okay. Like, if we jump into February the 1st, 1942, which is the point at which Quisling was finally appointed, after 2 years of waiting, finally appointed to a role referred to as Minister President. It was effectively Prime Minister, with his own cabinet of Norwegian cabinet ministers, all of whom were members of national unity. And I think that Quisling, who was aware of the fact that people, leading German Nazis, did not have much faith in him as a Nazi leader, I think he was very much aware of that fact, and he was determined to prove that the Nazification of Norway could be left to Norwegians.
Mm,
It did not need Germans to impose it upon them.
mm. But
Um,
as I said earlier, the Norwegian did not want to have any of the Nazification in Norway.
Absolutely not. And that's why, in some sense, it was an advantage to have such an incompetent man in charge of or attempting to impose the process. But what
Could it?
happened in
I'm sorry for interrupting you, but could it have gone quicker had there actually been German Nazis in charge of the Nazification process? Could the process run smooth, for lack of a better word, smoother, of Nazification of Norwegian people, propaganda, etc., could it have been more effective for if there had
No,
been Germany in charge?
yeah, no, I don't think so. I think the consistently uh, Germans, German leaders who came and visited Norway, Himmler, Ted Boven,
Mm.
Heydrich, they all much preferred a man called Jonas Lie, who was a career policeman and who became the Minister of Policing in
He
Quisling's
he
government.
he did survive after the World War as well, didn't he? He was even police minister after the War as well,
No, you mean
from
after
what I
the after,
remember.
no? Jonas Lie was he died.
Yeah,
He died. He
right.
was a
Yeah,
he died at Skull and this little anyway.
right.
But let's go back to the point, which is that Jonas Lie had this charisma that was so signally lacking in Quisling. And I think that, to be quite honest with you, to be quite honest with you in answering your question, I don't think that anybody ever could have Nazified the Norwegian society. They had no idea, blinded as they were by their racial theories, and that this must somehow lead to a feeling of brotherhood.
Mm.
They have no idea how left-wing Norway was as a country, how 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 much it was
Which it
dedicated.
still is, by the way, which it
It
still
still
is.
is. It still is.
At least until
It's
the next election, as far as I know.
well, yes, indeed, yeah. But no, I don't think anybody could have done it. I don't think anybody could have done it. But to return to your main question, which was the attempt to indoctrinate the youth of Norway into this new way of thinking. This was obviously recognised to be the most important thing to do, and it was the first thing that Quisling's government tried to do once it came into office after the 1st of February 1942. And one of the very first things they did was to try to establish a Norwegian version of the Hitler Youth Movement. It would be a kind of Norwegian youth movement, and this all children between the ages of 11 and 18 were to be compelled, in order to, quote, uh, heighten their sense of national pride, were compelled to join this Arbeidstjeneste, this work service group. It was a kind of form of national service, but its guiding lights and its philosophy would have been Nazi philosophy. They would have received education and classes in Nazi theory, and it would have, if it had been put into practice, but it was not put into practice. It would have been a very dangerous development. But it was not put into practice precisely because, among the other immediate responses to the first legislation that emerged from Quisling's government in February 1942, was this attempt to Nazify the school curriculum as well, and to Nazify the church. And within weeks of Quisling taking power, all the bishops had resigned. 90% of the Norwegian priests had resigned. Uh, Almost all Norwegian school teachers had refused to teach the new curriculum or even to attend
Because
school to do so.
to sort of to interrupt you again, the resistance really kind of started with the teachers. They refuse, like you said, they would refuse to follow the Nazi propaganda, and I would say that kind of this from the beginning. The resistance start with the teachers because they are kind of the key to educating the youth, obviously.
Yeah.
So there that's where the resistance really started, in my opinion.
Well, that's it. In the church, these functions, the church,
Mm.
the schools, and of course the parents who backed their children and who did so in the form of this fantastic campaign of protest letter writing, thousands of letters identical, all sent to the same address, the offices of the Ministry of Education, on the same day, all of them signed with the real name, not sent anonymously, with the real name and addresses of the senders, so that if they were going to start arresting one, they'd have to arrest thousands. So it was a very good example of Norwegian communal thinking, and not acting as individuals, but acting as a very powerful, not in a military sense, but in a social sense, a very
Mm.
powerful group. Because the schools simply closed down, there was nobody left to teach in the schools. The kids didn't go to school, and within a few weeks, the demand that they join this Nazified teachers' union and accept a new curriculum had to be withdrawn. And so it was 1942 was a crucial year in the occupation of Norway because it was the year in which you could say, I mean, Hitler Germany was still enjoying military successes all over Europe, but this was a defeat in his own backyard, if you like. And this would have been a huge feather in his cap, in the feather in the cap of Nazi philosophy in general, if they'd managed to push through this Nazi revolution in Norway. But they didn't manage to do it because the Norwegians simply refused to go along with it.
Mm. But there were some teachers who would, from what I remember, suffer the consequences. There were some who were indeed arrested and sent to, I mean, talk about the concentration camps later, but there were some who were sent, I believe, to concentration camps as a result of their refusal to follow the curriculum.
Yes, there were many teachers were sent up to do slave labor on the roads and railways and infrastructure work in the far north of Norway, bitterly cold and mistreated and not mistreated as badly as the thousands of East European prisoners who worked alongside them, because even when Norwegians were arrested, in most cases they were still treated with a degree of respect that was quite foreign to the way Nazis would treat other nationalities that they had arrested, because they still continued to think for long periods throughout the occupation. They continued to think that it was just a matter of time before Norwegians woke up to the idea of their racial heritage and that they were Germans and that they would embrace the idea of a Germania, a pan-Germanic empire in which they would be happily subsume their own national identity. Although, as the point you make, of course, is quite true, that Quisling and a faction within national unity always resisted that idea, and they wanted to see a German empire, but they wanted Norway to retain its independence within that empire.
Mm. So, and you mentioned religion and the priest as well. So let's talk about how the church resisted, the new Nazification program and the Nazi occupation of Norway, because that's another fascinating event as well. I would rather say I wasn't aware of this until I read your book, actually. So let's talk about how the priests would resist Nazi occupation.
Well, it was in many ways the same response to the same attempted Nazification. The priests were equally horrified as the teachers were and the parents were by these new attempts to introduce this kind of this Nazi spirit into the field of education, and they resigned en masse. The bishops who resigned en masse, and it meant that Quisling, who when he took power as minister president on the 1st of February 1942, he moved into the castle, the Slottet, in the middle of Oslo. He treated it as his offices. He became head of state and he became the head of the Norwegian church. He took on all these offices as the new head of state, but there was no church left
Kind
to
of
be a head
reminds
of.
me of someone in power of United States right now, to be honest
Well,
with
yeah,
you.
yeah, yeah, yeah. It's a valid point, but his he found himself head of a church with no one to be with no priests in it. There were a handful of National Unity Party members who were priests, extraordinary as that may seem. But some of the most heroic stories that emerged from the occupation are those that feature priests who simply refused to bow down to authority, and they were arrested pretty much like many of the teachers were. But of course, being men of the cloth, they were treated with respect. Most of them, I think one or possibly even two priests died as a result of the way they were treated in prison camps. But the church continued to function and to carry out. The priests continued to function and carry out things like baptism and marriage and funeral rites and so on. But none of this was legal until it had been then ratified by the national unity authorities. But the priests have suffered greatly. Very many of them were driven from their livings. These homes that follow the fact that you're the priest. It comes with the job. They were driven out, and they were driven out of the county in which they lived. And so, in many ways, it was the church played an enormously important role, and none more so than the Bishop of Oslo, who was a man called Eivind Berggrav, who became he was the leading figure in the movement to prevent Quisling's acceptance as the prime minister after that coup in the first week of the occupation. He said that anything rather than Quisling in power in Oslo. So he was one of the leading lights in the formation of the administrative council, which was the body that for the until the autumn or early winter of 1940 was the only form of quasi-legal government in Norway. They liaised with the Germans as they occupied ever more parts of the country, and so Berggrav was a leading light. Bishop Berggrav of Oslo was a leading light in the resistance movement, and a leading figure. He was, I think, he was arrested in about 1943, put under house arrest, and he stayed in house arrest until the end of the war. I think almost the end of the war.
Hmm. There's also this, and do forgive me, I keep forgetting the name, but there's also this bizarre. This is not with religion, but there is she she would later become the priest of the first female priest of Norway. But there's this rather bizarre event where this woman would send a letter to Quisling, and she would be kind of deemed insane by the psychiatrist in by judged by they were judging her. So let's talk about how one woman that would later become one of Norway's first female priests had had her way of resisting. And do forgive me, I forget her name. I'm sure you know who I'm talking about, but
It is,
she's a
yeah.
rather fascinating example of this.
She is an extraordinary woman. Her name was Ingrid Bjerkås, and she lived in Oslo. She had two school-aged children, and when the war broke out, she was she in her memoir, in her autobiography, she says that I wasn't particularly religious, but the war, she was so horrified by the whole idea of an occupation of the country being occupied that she carried out the first significant act of uh, not passive resistance. You couldn't really call it that. This is non-military resistance, and that came in. I think it was June 1940 when Ted Bofen, who was the Reichskommissar, the German Reichskommissar in Norway, he held his first speech in public. It was in front of the castle in central Oslo, in front of hundreds of thousands of soldiers. And she had decided that she was going to go there and try and prevent this speech being held. And what she actually did, it took tremendous courage, was she'd bought a little copy of the New Testament in German, and she made her way on the tram down to central Oslo, and she went up, and she very bravely and boldly strode forward. And I think the Germans were completely taken by surprise. They had not the faintest idea what she was intending to do, because don't forget that in the Nazi world, women really just belonged in the kitchen and in the bedroom. They had no, they were treated almost as grown
There were
children.
a few exceptions, of course, to the rule, but that's another
Yeah,
episode entirely.
yeah. But what so the Germans didn't know how to react to a woman moving forward in a apparently threatening way. But what she did was she threw this little small copy of the New Testament towards the speaker, which was not actually Ted Bofen, but it was Redis, I think. It was another German leader. And she just declaimed in this loud voice, she said, "No Germans are allowed to speak here. This is the country of the king and the Norwegian government. No Germans are allowed to speak here, and you must go home." And like this, she was, of course, immediately arrested and held. But within the day, she was, I think, released and sent back home. And it was regarded as being an eccentric aberration. But then she followed it up by writing letters to Quisling, the first of which she just pointed out to him that he was bringing shame and disgrace on Norway, and she demanded that he immediately dissolve national unity and step down from this disgraceful position which he'd assumed. And she got no reply, of course. And so a month later, she wrote another letter when she said, "I have not yet received a reply to my previous letter, in which I insisted that you dissolve national unity. And
If you fail, try and try again. As
I
the
know
saying
it.
goes.
Yeah, and she was great like that. She was also very active in the parents' movement. When looking after like the male teachers. Oh, it was only male teachers who were sent up to work to do slave labor up in the north. Uh, so that it meant the breadwinner was not at home. So she was very active, as many other women were, in looking after financially and in terms of food and affection. Those families suddenly without a breadwinner. So she was for me a very typical Norwegian heroine. She's the most one of the most typical Norwegian forms of resistance I can think of. It's not military, but it's completely intransigent. It's a very clear statement that this is not going to work here. You are not going to get away with this.
Mm.
So I write quite a bit about her in the book. And she did,
Mm.
as you point out, she was the woman, she became increasingly uh, impressed by the response of the priests and by Grav. And it's sufficiently impressed so that when the war ended, liberation came, at a very advanced stage, well over 50, uh, she became the first woman to train as a Lutheran priest, and her fighting spirit was needed again because nobody in the church in those days nobody would give her a job. So in the end, she had to go up to Senja. It was the only place way up in the north where she could get a job as a priest. So she's an extraordinary woman. Yeah, I became very fond of her. I really did.
Mm. Now, before, and there's another case that is fascinating, and that is, of course, Gunnar Volle, who is another extraordinary case, I think, and especially when it comes to double agents and conspiracies, because they both worked for the resistance and the Nazi government, and he's quite fascinating because he almost joined the resistance, but he was just just about too late to join. Everywhere he tried several times, but every time would be too late to come and join the resistance. So let's talk a little bit about Gunnar Volla as well, because he's rather another extraordinary figure in the Norway. And there's not I don't think even there's much I didn't know about him as another character I didn't know about before I read your book, because he's rather another extraordinary character in the Second World War history of Norway.
He is Gunnar Wall. Yeah, yes, as you say, he tried to join the military resistance, the fighting, but he found himself frustrated at every attempt. And I think in June, once the surrender was a fact, he returned to Oslo and went back to his job as a career policeman. And he was his fate was he ultimately he was what's known in Norwegian as a politifullmektig. It's a job I can never find an
Kind of
exact
a
English
sheriff role, I would say. I think that's
sheriff,
the best
something
best
like that.
title.
Yeah, and but his most important work, resistance work, came about as a person who photographed secret documents, which his work gave him access to.
How did
He
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 come to join the resistance working for the Nazi government? Because like you said, it was too late to join active resistance. But how did he
uh,
get in touch with the resistance? How did he
I
get
don't know. I
into
don't know
this
how that was.
work?
I think what happened was he simply said he met one of his former colleagues uh, in about 1942. I think he met a former colleague and told him that he was thinking of trying to make his way over to England to get to join to try
Mm.
again. And this colleague said, "Look, you're a member of the Statspolitiet. That's like the Norwegian version of the Gestapo, the political police. You're a
Mm.
member of the police force. You could do far more work, valuable work for the Norwegian resistance if you stay here and simply provide the resistance with all sorts of advanced information on actions, information on the kind of weapons that the state police were using, the kind of operations they were planning, uh, all sorts of things. He took thousands of photographs of documents, micro photographs of documents. He also made it his business to attend at least one execution uh, of a patriot organized by uh, the Norwegian Nazis. They had set up this court that had the power to hand down a death sentence. Uh, and he made it his business to attend one of these executions. It was out at Ekeberg, and he then wrote a report to Miloig in which he gave the names of all of those involved in it, the firing squad, the officer who had arranged it, uh, and this was made its way over to London, and the names of these people were read out over the free Norwegian radio from the BBC in London, and a matter of weeks, 2 weeks later, I think the man who had led that execution was gunned down by unknown gunmen, Miloig reprisals, and so Waller's main function, though, in many ways, was it was his job to examine cases that were potentially going to go to court and decide whether or not these should in fact go to court or whether they should be dealt with in some other way. And what he did consistently was he obstructed every attempt that was made to protect members of national unity who were guilty of all sorts of bullying behavior, violent behavior, which the regime was very anxious to just have these people. Well, this is they can do that. This is okay. He made it quite clear all the time that it should be treated as ordinary criminality and should face a court. So that he posed as a very devout Nazi. It was an extraordinary double game, and it was all the more extraordinary if you bear in mind that he had to play that role all the time, so that even his neighbours thought he was a member of more or less the Norwegian Gestapo. He walked around in his uniform and so on. So he sustained and lived within and survived within the hatred of almost every decent person who ever came across him.
Well, what's
So
even kind of sad is that he's not even acknowledged as a double agent, and in today he's not even remembered as a kind of resistant and for the, again for the lack of a better word here resistant hero of
mm,
the Second World War that nobody even knows his name, so to speak, from
no,
what I know.
no,
That he
yeah,
should be more remembered than what he is. And if you want to make a movie,
yeah.
you should definitely make a movie about this guy because he definitely deserves one.
I agree. I agree completely. But I think possibly one reason is that really good work of the kind he does prevents things happening.
Mm.
So that nothing, if he does his job well, things don't happen. I know that one of his most significant actions was to give for want of a better word, the priests' union uh, a warning that their offices were about to be raided. It gave them the chance to remove all their documentation. So when the Starport arrived at the given address, there was nothing there for them to take. So nothing happened. But that's because Wally had given them this tip before the raid was made. So that's in some ways why people we do very naturally we prefer action heroes like Max Malnus and Gunnar
Mm.
Sønsteby and who do things and uh, make loud noises or blow
Yeah.
places up like the Oslo. It looks a lot more dramatic. It's a lot easier to relate to rather than someone who makes sure bad things don't happen.
I mean, to be fair, people do love double agents and trying to spy movies. So, to be
Yeah, they
fair,
do. Yeah. I
but
have to say one of the one one of the reviewers of my book in England described Vaughan as a character worthy of Le Carre. I don't know if you
hmm,
know Le Carre's novels, but
I'm not familiar
it
with
is
him
a
now.
no, it's a very good point.
Mm.
Mm,
The next topic I want to talk about is the concentration camp because of course this being a Nazi occupation, Norway did of course not escape concentration camps, and one of the most famous one is Grini, of course. And here in Trøndelag where I live, we have a Falstad. But so let's talk a little bit about the concentration camp
mm,
system in Norway under the Second World War.
mm. It's not something I write about a great deal about, but Grini was the most famous camp down in the south. I suppose it was the term concentration camp usually throws up in the popular imagination. It means things like Buchenwald and Bergen-Belsen and so on. I
Auschwitz,
think
for example.
Auschwitz, of course, but I think the concentration camps were a little more because, again, of this special status that Norwegians had in the eyes of the Nazi regime. They were a little more civilized. They were generally speaking better conditions there. People were made to work, but they could get out messages. They could carry, they could, they could be. I mean, one man, Bounty Lund, whose book I recently read, who spent 4 years in Guinea and then was sent to Sachsenhausen in Germany. He met his mother by secret messages when he was out working in a Labour Party in a working party, and she was had to bring him chocolate, a bar of chocolate or something like that. Uh, Guinea was the place where most of the and a great many people who later became very prominent figures in Norwegian public life passed through the gates of Guinea, which is just it's just outside Oslo. It's about 20-minute
Is it
drive.
still a camp today? If you can you see still remains of
Oh, the
Greenie?
Rainzy remains are still there, and it still looks pretty much. When you see photographs of Guinea with the rows of buildings, you still see some of those rows of buildings. There's a museum there for anybody who's interested. There's a small museum, war museum of that. It was originally built as a woman's prison camp, uh, and it was just finished when the occupation began, and I think some of its first prisoners were Norwegian soldiers and soldiers who had fought against the Germans, but who were and been captured, but who were then released after being asked to give their word of honor that they would not take up arms again against the occupation. Many of them did that, of course. They gave their word of honor because they thought, what on earth does a word of honor mean to a Nazi?
Yeah.
So that they were mostly released, and from that point onwards, it was well, most people would. People who were arrested for being involved in the production of illegal newspapers, for example, everybody who was arrested seems to have at some point passed through Grini. But really, the really terrible concentration camps, I think, I'm not sure that they existed in Norway to the same extent as they did in Eastern Europe, for example.
Okay. Now the next topic I want to talk about is the quote unquote Jewish problem, as
Mm.
the Germans call it. So let's talk about because and we discussed this before we recorded as well that the in Norway, there weren't a whole lot of Jews in the country because of the constitution when it was made in 1814. We did actually make an episode about this 2, 3 years ago that I would highly recommend checking out. But in the original constitution, there were no Jews allowed in Norway until it was changed in 1853. So you can actually change the constitution. So take that, America. I'm just saying such an amendment. I'm joking there, but so let's talk about how the Jewish population of Norway were and how the Nazi government would handle this, because it wasn't really until I think it was about 1943, 1948, 1942 that they would begin to tackle this so-called problem that in
Mm.
the German
Yeah,
mind.
yeah. Yeah. Well, as you correctly say, there were very few. I think there were well under 2,000. Uh,
I believe that's something over 1500 or so
yeah,
in
yeah. I
Norway.
mean, and most of them lived in Trondheim and
Yeah.
Oslo. I think they were mostly in the big cities. But there was no. One of the most striking quotes from the few documents that emerged from that Wannsee conference, at which they decided upon the attempt to exterminate the Jewish race, was a comment by a man called Martin Luther, with that very striking name, who made the point that there were so few Jews in Norway that it could not be described as a problem at all. But nevertheless, as a matter of principle, I think once Quisling took office in early in 1942, he immediately said about the attempt to uh, not to get rid of the Jews. I mean, I think that it was not. I don't really know how. dedicated national unity were in the 30s when the party was started to the whole idea of of the demonization of the
I
Jews.
mean, to do one comparison, in Italy, you didn't hit Mussolini, for example, didn't really care much about the Jews. I mean, they were mistreated for sure, but it wasn't
Mm,
until 1943 really that they started to deport the Jews in
yeah,
Italy.
yeah, yeah. I think once the occupation became a fact, then Quisling realized that he had to pepper his speeches a lot more with anti-Semitic rhetoric and no
Was
full
he
length.
himself necessarily an anti-Semitic person, or was he?
I don't, I think he might have been in principle anti-Semitic for the reasons in which I'm about to give, which is that I think he realized it was such an important part of Nazi philosophy that if he hoped to be allowed to carry on governing an independent Norway at the head of a government of Norwegian Nazis, then he would have to learn to employ that rhetoric and play that game, and he did. But let's go to the very beginning. Let's go back very early on and say, for
Mm.
example, the very one of the very first things the Nazis did when they occupied Oslo, the next day I think it was to order all Jewish residents to hand in their radios. And of course, this is the first step in the demonization of the Jews, the idea being that the Jews are not loyal to the country in which they live. They're loyal to the idea of international socialism. You cannot trust them. So they were told to hand in their radios, and this was part of course, something that was then applied to the whole population about a year later, I think, unless you were actually a member of National Unity. But the when Quisling took power as minister president early in 1942, his minister of justice, a man called Sverre Risnes, um, concocted this idea and gave it the excuse that, in fact, he was acting out of a spirit of constitutional fundamentalism. He returned to the Constitution that paragraph forbidding Jews to be in Norway, which had been removed uh, by after the agitation of Wergeland, the poet Wergeland in the 1840s, I think it was. They returned that paragraph to the Norwegian constitution on the grounds that it was constitutional fundamentalism, nothing anti-Semitic. It's just that you're not allowed to fiddle with the constitution, blithely ignoring the fact that everything they had done was an affront to the constitution and a fiddling with the constitution. But anyway, it made the presence of Jews at a stroke in Norway illegal. There was then this usual process of making them come attending a police station to have their Jewish identity stamped with a J in their identity papers. Uh, they were made to register their property, their financial assets. Uh, but you sense all the time that the Nazi overlords were waiting for an opportunity for something that could be almost considered, I think I describe it in the book as the equivalent of a Sarajevo incident, something that could actually precipitate a full-scale attack on the Jewish population. And this came about when a border guide, a patriotic border guide, guiding a party of Jewish citizens over the border into Sweden. This is in September 1942 when they were arrested by a Nazi police officer who demanded to see their papers, and the guide had to shoot him, and this caused, of course, a sensation, killing a policeman, much as it would do now, and it precipitated within a matter of days. It precipitated a general order that in the first instance, all male Jews should be arrested, and they were to and they were arrested and they were kept in various of these concentration camps that we've spoken of. And then a month later, a similar order went out that all remaining Jews, I should say old people, women, and children, should also be arrested. And so that I think it was by but the end of October, the entire Jewish population was under arrest, and they were very quickly shipped out on board the Donau. Uh, And those who could work, capable of work, were separated out from their families, and everybody else was sent straight to the gas chambers.
Mm,
And some of the Jews that had not managed to be transported to Oslo in time to be taken on board the Donau were taken on board one or two smaller later shipments to meet the same fate, either worked to death or gassed and killed immediately. And so that, and of course, one would also add that at the same time there was uh, considerable activity on the part of good patriots who tried to help Jews who had been warned of these developments across the border, mostly into Sweden.
mm.
And
So let's
but
talk a
but
little bit about and we can talk more about the resistance a little bit in a few moments. But let's talk about those who helped the Jews to escape and the Jews who actually made it to Sweden. But from my understanding, not all were accepted into Swedish territory as well. Some were sent back to. Because, like we said in the beginning, Sweden were more pro Germany than pro Allied in pretty much until 1943 or even later on at least. So let's talk about that, about how the few lucky Jews were able to escape into Sweden, a neutral country.
well, most of them, because as I said, most of the Jews lived in Oslo,
Mm,
and so that the obvious escape route for those who had been warned was over the border via Halden into Sweden. And there's a rather remarkable story attached to how these warnings were delivered. Uh, women were women were women were quite significantly involved in this process of helping the Jews to escape over the border. Uh, a woman called the Sigrid Eliassen Lund, who lived in Oslo up the road here in Vinderen, she 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 received a telephone call one night from somebody who said, in Norwegian, of course, she said that det er et stort selskap i kveld. De skal ha de store pakker. There's going to be a big gathering. There's a big event on tonight. They want the big packages. And she and her friend sitting there, they thought, what does this mean? What on earth could this mean? And then they figured it out that it was coded, of course. It was almost certainly a policeman, a patriotic policeman, who was telling them that the Jews, male Jews, the big packages were about to be arrested. So that led to feverish activity throughout the night as they went on warning as many people as they could, organising safe houses for Jews who, of course, had to leave their addresses immediately and be put into safe houses until they could be transported over the border into Sweden. And then the same thing happened a month later. They get a second message saying there's going to be another big occasion tonight. And this time they want the small packages, which is all the children, the women, and the old people. And the same procedure was then repeated. They had to find all sorts of safe houses for the Jews to be hidden in until they could be taken over the border. There was also, one should add, probably the most efficient rescue operation was Carl Fredriksen's Transport, which was a fleet of lorries operating under this name, Carl Fredriksen's Transport, which carried over dozens of people at a time, mostly Jews during this particular period, carried dozens of people over the border in covered lorries. Very often, these people being drivers who had legitimate authority to be in the region for various reasons. They would be people collecting wood for burning in the generators that kept the engines going, or farmers collecting produce for the shops of Oslo. So that between them, I think they got out something about half of the Jewish population of Norway.
That's an
And
amazing number,
it
really.
is an amazing number, and but the a very large number, only a very few who were deported on board the Donau, five or six, I think, survived the war and came home.
Hmm. There is one interesting that kind of struck me a little bit, and you're right about that. And I think there is a documentary about him as well. I think I saw it many years ago, but there's one who came home, and when he came home, his apartment were occupied. And do forgive me again, I don't remember his name, but there's one who, and I believe this was most cases with Jews all over. Nazi
mm,
occupied Europe that came home to apartments that were the
yeah,
home or houses where
yeah,
they were already occupied by other people by the time they came home.
yeah, yeah. I think yes. Well, I suppose. I mean, as people consistently say on both sides, consistently said back then, people on the right side and on the wrong side, if you like. It's impossible for us at this distance in time to imagine what it's like. But let's say that, for example, there's an assumption that the people who did that would be national unity people, but not necessarily so. I don't think it would just be to people at that time living in that surreal, bizarre dream world of violence and military occupation. It would just be an empty flat. But yes, he did go back to his apartment in Jonas Reinsgate, and
You
he said,
remember his name?
I
Because
can't
I
remember.
don't.
I can't remember, but he became a very significant figure in the he came back to, of course, he survived. He was about 20 or 21 years old. He survived and he came back, and he became a very significant figure in the restructuring of Jewish society in Norway. No, I can't remember his name.
Hmm. And speaking of, the next step is of course the resistance movement, and one of the most prominent figures in Norwegian, at least Norwegian history, is Max Manus. But you don't write a whole lot about him. But so let's talk a little bit about the resistance movement in Norway and how it. Because now I would compare this to France, and I would say it wasn't one movement like in the French occupation. There were several mini movements inside
Hmm.
the occupied country. So let's talk a little bit about how the resistance movement worked and how they would resist Nazi occupation.
Well, the military resistance, because that's what Miloig, which is what it was known as, short for military organization for our English listeners. And there was this, the women I've just been talking about who helped the Jews, they were members of Sivoig, which means civilian organization. But the Miloig was, once the occupation was a fact, in due course, and once the government in London had established itself, they gave they gave certain people in Norway official status as the army or their military arm in Norway, and this is what became Miloig. But they, because of the Nazis' habit, especially in the from about 1941 onwards, because of the Nazi habit of carrying out draconian reprisals for any killing of a Nazi, whether he be German or Norwegian,
Sinking of boats.
sinking of boats or whatever was done. I mean, they would Telavåg, the whole village was burnt to the ground. I think all male, or dozen men and boys were shot. All the women were sent to a concentration camp because of this habit of the Nazis of trying to terrorize the population into acquiescence. The um, the government in London advised Miloy consistently, do not use violence. Do not fire at a German, even if he fires at you. And so that for a large part of the war, Miloy was, I don't know, it's to me the more interesting, and this is just a personal foible of mine, if you like, the more interesting aspect of the violent reaction to the occupation was that carried out by the communist, the
Yeah.
unofficial movement run by this group called Oswald Group, the Oswald Group, named for one of the pseudonyms of the leader of the group, who was a man called Asbjørn Sunde. And as soon as Barbarossa, which was the name given to the Nazi invasion of Soviet Russia in June 1941, as soon as that was a fact, and that was a breach of the non-aggression pact that had been signed before the war between Stalin and Hitler. Uh, as soon as the Germans attacked Soviet Russia, then this group, this Ostwald group, this Asbjørn, he set about a most extraordinary campaign of explosions and sabotage and far more active in that sense, in a violent sense, than in me. Like, for the very good reason that he acted completely on his own initiative. He wasn't taking instructions from anybody. He was simply acting, if you like, on a basic instruction from the Communist Party in Moscow that it's okay, the Germans are now fair game. You may attack them. And he really didn't. He was a very extremely interesting person, Osbjörnsson. He'd fought in the Spanish Civil War. He learned all sorts of tricks like silent killing and how to make bombs and so on. And so several of his members of the group had also been in the Spanish Civil War with him. So they were very well versed, unusually for Norwegian citizens.
Mm.
They were well versed in how to use violence against an enemy. And until about 1944, they were the real face of violent resistance in terms of killing dangerous Norwegian Gestapo policemen, or blowing up offices where important documentation relating to this work service, to which all young people should be in called, blowing up the offices so that these documents could not be traced and these people couldn't be called in to do this national service. Uh, it was not until about 1944 when it became obvious that Germany was losing the war, and that they were going to need all their troops back home in Germany to defend the German borders. And there was over 375, 400,000 German troops in Norway. So that the Milorg's greatest and most important contribution really was from about 1944 onwards, when they systematically blew up as many railway lines as they could to prevent and disrupt the lines of transportation so that these soldiers could not be sent back to mainland Europe to help defend the German borders.
Mm. And one of the more significant resistance events, so to speak, in Norway is the blowing up the Wehrmacht plant, which was, of course, a vital resource to the German nuclear program. And of course, as we now know, Hitler weren't that interested in a nuclear program because it's thought of it as a Jewish science. But still, it's one of the most famous occurrences in Norwegian resistance history is, I would say, the Wehrmacht plant operation. So let's talk a little bit about that one as well, if you don't mind.
Well, as you say, that the purpose of that was to disrupt, and rather like the purpose was the same as the American attack on the Iranian nuclear facilities, to prevent the Nazis building, making nuclear weapons, atom bombs. Um, and it was, in the first instance, it was a dreadful failure, because two gliders carrying British commandos who were supposed to carry out the raid crashed.
And they forgive me, I think one of them actually ended up in Trolltitz after one of them were captured. I don't remember who, but some of the
Mm,
British
mm.
commandos ended up in the prisoner of war castle Trolltitz in Germany.
And they were the ones that the most of the ones who were tortured, and shot, even though they were wearing uniform. But that was a preliminary to that was just a failed attempt to carry out this sabotage operation. The actual sabotage operation, I think, is called Grouse, the Grouse Group, was carried out by about a group of about 5 or 6 Norwegian commandos. Uh, and it went off in a way, it was remarkably easy, because they made their approach via a particularly steep descent, which nobody thought it was possible to enter the plant that way, and they did. And
Norwegians know their skiing, that's for sure.
well, yeah, but it turns out actually that the Germans. The Germans didn't. The Germans who were in charge, the people on night duty at the thing, didn't even know where the light switches were. So when they heard the explosion go off, apparently some German guy came out and looked around, but he didn't know where the light switch was. So we just went back inside. They didn't even really know that the plant had been attacked, and it's one of those. It's one of those. And what happened in the end, of course, was that the plant resumed operation after several weeks, but then the Germans decided to resume the operation in Germany, and they shipped all the heavy water out on its way to Germany. But the ferry taking it across Tinsha, I think it was called, was blown up, and so that all that water, heavy water, sank, or went to the bottom of the fjord. But as you say, what's perfectly true is that Hitler was had much more faith in the V2 rockets than he ever did, and they weren't really that close. In general, the general opinion is that they weren't really that close to to um,
to a nuclear program.
to finalizing the atom bomb. Yeah.
Mm. So let's talk about the inevitable when it was obvious that Germany were losing the war, and you talked about how they blew up railway to prevent the soldiers from leaving Norway. So let's talk about the inevitable when they realized what was the national feeling when they realized that Germany were about to lose the war, and what they were hope that independence would be soon over, and that what were the worries about what would come after the German occupation, and what were the national feeling there?
My this is a subjective response, but my feeling is probably that the people were very afraid, uh, and they would be very afraid because certain members of the hierarchy of the Nazi Party, for example, the chief of the Norwegian Stapo, a man called Martinsen, was known to be a fanatical Nazi, and it was very, very possible, in the opinion of many people, that when defeat became inevitable, people such as him would in fact lead a last violent stand that would lead to the deaths of thousands of sort of civil war.
Which kind of would was to happen in the Finnmark and in Northern Norway when the Russians came to occupy and came into Norway to which they were the first one to enter, from what I remember. They were the first one to actually enter Norway, the
Yes, they
communist
were. Yeah, yeah,
Russia.
yeah, yeah. But the Allies had already, of course, Hitler couldn't know this, but Hitler's great fear was that they would, well, the great fear of Hitler and of the Quisling regime was that the Nazis, the Soviet army would occupy the north of Norway, and that they would then probably move the government and the king back, so that would be a very, very dangerous, psychologically very dangerous development for Quisling's government. So what they actually decided to do was Hitler's personal order was to make Finnmark impossible, make it an impossible place to live for Soviet soldiers. Uh, people were
The local
everybody
population be damned.
exactly, and he said tenderness has no place. When people said when people when he realized that people were going to be told leave your home. It's going to be burnt. You're going to have to move down south in the country. All your animals, all your livestock is going to be killed or eaten or used for military purposes, for German military purposes. He
Mm.
said that pity is not an appropriate response to these things. This has to be done. And it was done. It was done. Thousands and thousands of Nordlendinger, the people from the north of Norway, were shipped down south in appalling conditions, of course. Many, many more went to live in the wilds. Many of them moved into underground mines, coal mines, and hid themselves there and lived there for 2 months. Even had a flock of goats in there, herd of goats, and just lived there. And even babies were born in there. But then, when the Russian soldiers came, uh, they were liberated, and the North was liberated, effectively liberated by the end of 1944. But what Hitler didn't know was, and he was so afraid that in fact the Russians would continue down southward,
Mm.
was that the Allies had already made a pact that the Russians would not, and
Mm. The Tehran conference, of course.
yeah, and that the Brits would have authority in the south of the country when that time came, and that the Russians would have the authority in the north of the country temporarily until the liberation and the new arrangements could be put in place. So, and the Russians did. The Russians made no attempt to move beyond a particular line.
It's interesting that they didn't want any part of Norway because like we said earlier, that it is an eye-free port, so would have been interesting vital for trade and etc. But so it's
Mm,
interesting that Stalin didn't want any interest in Norway at all. It should have had an eye-free port 365 days a year. So it's interesting that he didn't want interest.
yeah.
Maybe not fortunate as well that he didn't want any part of Norway as Norway at all.
Sure, yeah. But I think, of course, if he'd done anything like that, he would have lost all, he would have lost all his friends.
Mm.
He would have lost the Brits, the Americans, and so you know they behaved well enough.
Mm.
Those Roosevelt and Stalin and Churchill, they behaved well enough. They did as well as they could under those extraordinarily difficult circumstances, I think.
Mm. We are going to run up soon. I'm sorry for keeping it longer than you initially wanted, but we have to talk about the aftermath of the Second World War.
Mm,
And of course, like the Nuremberg trials in Germany, Norway had its own trials, and of course, Quisling are famously among them. So let's talk about the aftermath and the trials of the those who were committed Nazis, because even though most of Norwegian population resisted the Nazi occupation, there were some who were even though they were a minority, there were some who were very pro-Nazi and very
mm,
who actually did join and among them, of course, we haven't talked about them, but there were people who were fighting in Russia, in etc. So let's talk a little bit about those who
mm,
were put on trial and the aftermath of the Second World War in Norway.
mm. Well, to me, the most interesting fact about that, the judicial aftermath of that whole process following the liberation, the most interesting fact is that the government in London had announced at an early stage of the occupation that membership of national unity was a criminal offence. And this, in fact, this was legislation that was retroactive, uh, unconstitutional, but they did it. And it meant that when the war came to an end, along with all the people like this horrific torturer Henry Yinan, along with leaders of the movement like Quisling, um, that people who had only really joined the party in order to perhaps get some extra ration coupons, or who had in fact had just hadn't even it had paid no significant part in their lives at all, they found themselves being threatened with uh, all sorts of very unpleasant reprisals, including, for example, for simple membership where you weren't fined or jailed, where you were simply a very minor member of the party who never did anything, you would still lose your right to vote. I think it was for 10 years. And worse than that, your name would be blackened. And in a small society like Norway, there's really no hiding place for for someone uh, who falls off the wagon in that way, who becomes an outcast, and it made
And
rather a
someone,
lot.
sorry for interrupting you again, but someone we haven't really discussed is the women who were fraternizing with German soldiers or German officials. They were,
Yeah,
as
mm,
was and this was kind of general in most occupied areas where they would be shaved their heads off and
mm,
sorry, the hair was shaved off their heads, and
yeah,
they
yeah,
were
yeah,
punished. And I knew. And my family knows someone who were actually the daughter of someone who were fraternizing with a German agent. And she had a really tough childhood because her
yeah,
mother she was a daughter of a soldier from the Nazi occupation, and
yeah,
the children would really suffer.
mm,
And just as it may seem, they would really suffer the consequences of their mothers being fraternizing with German soldiers.
yeah, yeah. I think it's probably worth mentioning also that a lot of the occupation in the north of the country, of which we've just spoken, was in many ways quite different from the occupation in the south.
Mm.
There were no illegal newspapers produced at all in the north of Norway, and the soldiers would be
You do have the
billeted.
famous story of the Night Man, as it's called, where in the
Yes,
north of Norway, but that,
yeah, yeah,
yeah.
yeah. Uh, um, but no, you just to just sum that up, that the trials, the main. There was no way that they were not going to execute Quisling, because I think
Mm.
Gerhardsson was told there will be violence in the
When went the
streets.
discussion if he was actually if he was really fit for trial, if he was mentally insane, or there were
Yeah,
discussions about whether he was actually fit for trial.
there were, but there was no way realistically, and it's very easy for us at this 80-year distance in time not to understand this, but there was no
Mm.
way realistically that they could have not executed him, and
Yeah.
also the other leading Nazis that they executed, and members of his cabinet, uh,
I
because
mean,
it,
to do a comparison, imagine like today in Norway that if Anders Behring Breivik would walk free among the street and the outrage that would be it would be the same as
yeah,
if you that Quisling walked free
yeah,
among it would be the same thing. Like he wouldn't last a day outside. People would murder him,
yes, yeah,
Breivik, if he came out in public life. So
yeah.
there is, it's kind of the same thing.
Yeah, yes, it is. It is, and because no, we in the first 2 years or so after uh, the liberation, that there was a huge desire for revenge, and people were executed, of course, and also torturers like Henry Dinnan were executed. Uh, but um, that desire for revenge very rapidly faded away. And for example, Quisling's doctor, Hans Eng, who was given a 7-year sentence, but his trial didn't come up until 1948. He'd already been in jail
Yeah.
for half of it, so he was released immediately. And I think the last war prisoner, related to that occupation and the and national unity and all that, the last was released, I think, in it was out and walking the streets by mid 1950s. So it's that desire for revenge had faded very, very quickly, but it was there to
Mm.
begin with.
I want to mention someone, and I know that you like his work, and that is, of course, the famous author Knut Hamsun, that who was very pro-German and very pro-Nazi. So, what happened to him? Because we haven't discussed him much, but I kind of want to bring him up anyway at the end of this episode because I
Mm.
feel like he's kind of relevant to this.
Yeah. Well, yes. I mean, I wrote a book about him. He was my favorite author when I was a young man. Uh, although his
What was it? And what was the treatment of him after the Second World War, considering he was a Nazi sympathizer?
Well, he was tried under this legislation that made membership of national unity illegal, and his defence, or his lawyer's defence, was that he wasn't actually a member. He was just a sympathiser, but he'd never actually joined the party. And in a documentary sense, it's actual fact true. He never did join the party,
But he
but
was a
he went.
sympathizer.
Oh, he was a sympathiser. Oh, yes, and he wrote a necrology for when Adolf Hitler died, and people had thought that Hitler had fallen in battle and not committed suicide. He wrote this absurd necrology for him, in which he praised him as a reformer, a great reformer of mankind, and we bow our heads in grief now that he's dead, and so on. But please remember, he was well over 80, uh, and there was some attempt made to put him on trial, but um, he was protected from that by being sent for psychiatric analysis in a clinic in Vinderen, uh, at which they determined that he was not in any way unfit to stand trial, but he suffered from what was referred to as varig svekkede sjelsevner, which translates in English into something like permanently weakened mental faculties, which is a way of saying he didn't really know what he was doing. And there's an argument, not as a kind of
That sounds ludicrous in hindsight.
oh,
It
it
kind of
is,
sounds
yes,
ludicrous.
it is. But they also, because afterwards he then wrote this extraordinary book called On Overgrown Paths by Gjengrodde Stier about his incarceration and his psychiatric examination. It's an extraordinary book. But there's absolutely no question at all that he was a big supporter. He wasn't an ideal. I think he was a man who was indifferent to politics, but he detested the kind of change that he saw coming over Norway with the arrival of very, very left-wing communism. Of course, he was an extremely individualistic person who detested socialism. And I think, like so many people, of course, the press was much more censored in those days. He didn't really know, as many people didn't know, what was actually going on in the name of German National Socialism. It's no excuse for him because he should have just kept his mouth shut. Like all great artists, they should not get involved in politics.
Imagine if Twitter had existed in those
Oh,
days. What they
I don't even like to think of it. But he should have done like Edvard Munch, because the Germans wanted Munch to get involved, but he said no. I'm having nothing to do
Yeah,
with it. Nothing.
yeah. So, forgive me for doing another analogy, but he's kind of was the J.K. Rowling of his days, where he was a great author, but not really a good person, to put
Well,
it
yeah,
that
maybe.
way.
Yeah, yeah.
So I think we're gonna round up there, and thank you so much again for coming on the podcast. It's been a great pleasure to talk with you. You are always welcome back, of course. And before you go, if people have any further questions about this topic, or if people want to read your book, Norway's War, the 1940, a people's struggle against Nazi tyranny, 1940 to 1945, which of course, if you are on YouTube, you can see I'm holding it up here. Where do people find the book? And of course, where do people find you if they have any questions they want to ask you, perhaps about this topic, or if they want to explore more work on this? And where can people find you on social media? And another question I want to ask you is, do you have because there are no lack of movies set in the Second World War in Norway about the occupation. Do you have a favorite movie that is portrayed in the Second World War, of course?
Well, I think a film that I like greatly, it's also for personal reasons that I don't have time to go into here, but it involves my wife's grandfather.
Mm-hmm.
It's that film Krigsseilerna. I don't know what it's called in English, The War Sailors. It's just the jet. Christopher Jonas plays in it. It's a very recent film, 3 or 4 years old, I think. And Krigsseilerna is a wonderful. It's not focused on an individual hero, just on this group of Norwegian seamen who did such extraordinary brave work and received very little recognition for it after the war. As regards my own book, well, people can buy it in any good bookshop. I believe it's in all the if they're watching this in the UK, well, any bookshop will have it. The bookshops here in Oslo have it. Um, the
I
libraries,
found it
like,
in Tronsmoen, actually, one of my favorite bookshops in
yeah,
Oslo.
okay, yeah, it's a good shop. The library has it too, I think. And I have a website, robertferguson.org, with my email address there. If anybody wants to get in touch and take up any kind of discussion about those things, because it's a absolutely fascinating subject. I'd never
Oh yeah,
tire of it.
I
Yeah.
really hope this book will stand the test of time, and that more people it will inspire more people to study Norway internationally, not just in Norwegian society or Norwegian community, but that it will be in, inspire people to perhaps read more about this topic as
Yeah.
well. And you know, when it comes to my personal favorite, maybe because it came up when I was young, and it kind of a movie that I kind of grew up on. I would say Max Manus is my personal. It should be
Yeah.
out on Netflix and YouTube, or,
Mm.
or if you want to watch it, it should be available internationally as well. It's a fabulous movie, and I
Yeah.
think the guy who wrote the movie actually wrote. He's passed away, but he actually wrote it as his college thesis as a manuscript when he wrote the
Yeah.
movie. From
Okay.
what I remember reading about, I may be wrong,
Yeah.
but
Yeah. Yeah. No, it's a
but that's
great
one of
film.
my
Yeah. Yeah.
personal
Yeah.
favorite as
Yeah.
well. And
Yeah.
it's
I enjoy.
actual handy, so what more is it to like?
Yeah.
But I think we're gonna round it up there. Thank you again so much for coming. It's been a great pleasure to have you on. This has been about that age well. You can find us on social media on the Instagram, Twitter, or Blue Sky under that age well. You can find us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, wherever you can find podcasts these days. If you're on Spotify, just leave us 5 stars or leave a comment, as you can do now on Spotify. If you're on Apple Podcast, consider leaving a review. That would be very nice. I love reading reviews of the podcast. If you're on YouTube, also leave a comment. And as well, if you want to see me cover more of Norway's war in the Second World War, or other countries perhaps that you would feel is have been not maybe not mistreated, but has been not been paid as much attention to as they should have. Please let me know. And this has been with that as well. My name is Alan, and I'll see you next time.